The Canadian government is on the cusp of unlawfully banning yet another 235 firearms here in February. Is it too little too late? Are we safe from confiscation? Is this the last desperate act of a dying government? Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be continuing the discussion about Canada's ever-evolving gun buyback saga. Today's developments actually aren't particularly new, but rather were a part of the discussions from parliamentary committees back in December. But with the Christmas break and now the prorogation of Parliament, this information is actually still about as recent and up-to-date as it gets. Some of you may have already heard about these developments from myself or other sources, but a lot of you probably haven't. And when you put these individual pieces together, it allows us to paint a much better picture of what we could expect in the coming months regarding the Liberals' upcoming firearm and magazine bans, as well as Phase 2 of the Buyback Program involving confiscating firearms from individual owners. So I'm going to start with a quick recap of the stuff that a lot of people may already be aware of, but then we'll get into more recent developments. The first of our videos here is from SECU on December 3rd, according to CalibreMag. And in it we see the previous Public Safety Minister Dominic LeBlanc, who has since been replaced by David McGuinty, discussing the plan for confiscating firearms from individual owners.
You are right. Phase 2 is when we will go to the homes of individuals and Sûreté du Québec and the police will help us. We will go look for those guns. It's an order in council that will come with the final list of prohibited weapons. That cannot be left open. In the coming days, I think I'll have something to say about that, about the next steps. We talked about a task force and technical team that will work with the RCMP. And that process is already underway. They have had meetings, a few meetings to date. I think there was one meeting last week.
So we have a couple of things to unpack there. First off, Dominic LeBlanc very clearly said that Phase 2 is when we will go to the homes of individuals, we will look for those guns, and the police will help us. Which sounds pretty dire. If they actually end up doing that way, that alone is a public safety crisis for firearms owners and for law enforcement, let alone an unbelievable waste of police resources. Now I say if, because it may not actually end up playing out exactly like that, and I'll tell you why in a minute here, but it appeared to be Dominic LeBlanc's plan as of less than 2 months ago. And this makes sense since Canada Post has repeatedly stated that they will not be participating in Phase 2 of the buyback, and no one else seems willing to help. So the only option is to use law enforcement to facilitate the confiscation. He also said that the final list of prohibited firearms was to be expected in the coming days, and he hinted at a task force which was working with the RCMP to help complete the ban list. And that ban list was then announced 2 days later in an order in council on December 5th, where the government unlawfully used the OIC powers to ban another 324 firearms.
Today, the government is adding a further 324 unique makes and models of assault-style firearms to the list of prohibited firearms in Canada.
However, on that day, LeBlanc said that also was not the final list, and that we should expect another final ban list here in early February.
As I stated, our work is not done. I am pleased to commit the government to completing this work before the buyback program is to begin. If I understand correctly, the RCMP will examine models such as the SKS that was controversial. Yes, that is work that will be done in the coming weeks, and by February, the work will be completed, and we will have a second list.
So we had the final ban list, which they promised they wouldn't expand back in 2020. Then we had the final ban list in December, and now we should expect the final ban list in February. And the process by which they had gone about deciding what to ban in December, as well as the upcoming ban in February, was detailed during this announcement.
The RCMP, when we talked to them about undertaking this work, we have a lot of confidence in the judgment and the expertise of the RCMP. I think Canadians do. I was glad that Madame Provost recognized the support that they can bring to this exercise. But we thought, and they thought, it would be useful to have access to a group of technical experts to support their work. This group has met a number of times over the last few weeks. It includes academics. It includes technical experts. There's an Indigenous person who will be participating. Some of them have asked that their names be kept discreet, but perhaps Deputy Commissioner Larkin could add something.
We looked at approximately 559 originally since over the last year, and now obviously we're currently announced the 324, which leaves about 230 firearms to continue the analysis. These ones we believe that we would benefit from external guidance to help our subject matter experts.
So it sounds like the government and the RCMP here have been secretly colluding with the gun control lobby in determining which firearms to ban. And that is honestly kind of rather unsurprising to anyone who's been following the progression of the confiscation plans up until this point. And for those who were not aware, this expert panel is not actually the Canadian Firearms Advisory Committee, CFAC, which, as CalibreMag explained in his video, this is a group of unnamed individuals working in secret with the RCMP to decide what to ban. That decision is then recommended to the government in the form of a list, and then the Government Order in Council bans that list. RCMP Deputy Commissioner Brian Larkin then confirmed they had a finite, predetermined list of 559 firearms they had been looking at banning over the last year, during which time LeBlanc told the public over and over that there was no actual plan to expand the ban list, and this culminated in the banning of 324 firearms in December. However, that doesn't mean that the remaining 235 firearms were safe. That just meant that they were having issued manufacturing reasons to ban them. Those remaining 235 firearms are now what's currently being discussed and are likely to be banned here in February, most notable of which is the SKS. And this could very well be the motivation for the other order in council, which was published earlier this year, but was enacted on December 16th. This unlawfully enacted OIC once again allowed the Register of Firearms to amend or destroy their records made under the Firearms Act, which were records specifically related to the classification determinations of firearms. There has been a lot of speculation as to what this new order in council actually does, and I even made a video on it detailing my thoughts, but a lot of people seem to believe that this allows the firearms reference table to be amended, thereby allowing the RCMP to reclassify firearms on a whim through the Specialized Firearms Support Service. It could be that the discussions between the Canadian Firearms Program and this secretive panel of so-called experts were having difficulties being able to recommend firearms to be banned due to the specifics of these records, and therefore those records had to be destroyed. It could also be that these records are going to be intentionally altered in order to lie and have people believe that the RCMP has always been of the mind that these certain firearms, like the SKS, were always dangerous assault weapons which needed to be banned for decades, and the government is only finally catching up to that recommendation. But, whatever the case, it seems like there are another 235 firearms on the chopping block for February, and most, if not all, of those firearms will be banned. And it's looking like the poster child for that final ban list will be the SKS. LeBlanc also promised to have a new order in council banning these so-called high-capacity magazines in March, and the Liberals have been promising to do that for years now, but they've been especially vocal about it since the beginning of Bill C-21, so they may finally make good on that.
In addition to banning these guns, we're also taking action on the regulatory front. We will also introduce further regulations on red and yellow flag laws early this spring, and regulations on large capacity magazines no later than March.
But which magazines they plan to ban remains to be seen. You can expect your pin mags to be banned, but they've also suggested that the magazine limits may apply to all magazines, including bolt-action and lever-action rifles, and also not to just detachable magazines, but also for tubular magazines. Meaning that some firearms, such as cowboy lever-action rifles and pump-action shotguns, may get rebranded as high-capacity assault weapons in March. However, there is some evidence to say that they won't be taking it quite that far, and that it will only apply to detachable magazines, but with yet another public safety minister taking over, we won't know exactly what this will entail until the OIC banning them actually drops. So, that's the recap up until now, and it paints a pretty dismal picture for us firearms owners. However, there is also a lot of good news regarding the state of the buyback, which shows that it's likely to never happen. And the biggest of this news is obviously the prorogation of Parliament and the impending non-confidence votes. The Liberals can OIC and ban all that they want, But they can't get the confiscation going without funding from Parliament, and they are likely to face an election before that can happen. But if Jagmeet goes back on his word and doesn't call for non-confidence whenever Parliament resumes, which, given Jagmeet's radically dishonest and untrustworthy track record, that is certainly possible. So if he reneges and we don't see an election until the fall, I think it's still worth detailing what Phase 2 of the buyback is expected to look like in its current form. And the rough bulk of this plan was detailed on December 10th at the Standing Senate Committee of National Finance. However, I was only made aware of it a few weeks ago by the YouTube channel Canada Info. So the long and short of it is that they were asking for $32 million to help them set up Phase 2 of the buyback program so that it could be ready for the promised launch in the spring of 2025. The committee wanted to know where this money was going and what it would be used for, and the answer from Public Safety and the RCMP hints as to what we should expect in the coming months.
We've also, that money is assisting us in the planning for Phase 2, which is the individual collection, and that would actually launch and coincide with our areas of jurisdiction over a 6-month period in the spring of 2025. And so we're working on operational plans to collect approximately 30,000 firearms in areas that the RCMP provides service, and we'll also support smaller and mid-sized agencies that need national support in collection.
So now we know that the plan is to begin the program in the spring of 2025. And somehow, the RCMP expects to only collect 30,000 firearms from individuals, and only in their areas of jurisdiction. Now, I have no idea how they figured that confiscating firearms from potentially millions of firearms owners in Canada would only result in 30,000 firearms, and even if you consider that is only from their area of jurisdiction. And, their jurisdiction, meaning that they likely only plan to confiscate from rural individuals and not from cities. So, even though the buyback itself will be funded by the federal government, larger urban centers will likely need to send their own officers and divert their own police resources in order for confiscation to take place, since the RCMP doesn't usually operate in those areas and won't have the manpower alone to cover the entire country in merely 6 months. And we see the beginning of this already happening in Winnipeg. Winnipeg is debating requesting $3.4 million to facilitate the collection, storage, and destruction of these firearms. Now, how they think it would cost so little to implement in a city the size of Winnipeg is beyond me, but it's also worth noting that these funds aren't for the buyback itself, but rather just for the facilitation of the buyback. This money isn't the money the government is giving to gun owners in exchange for confiscation. This money goes to boots on the ground to actually go around and do the confiscating. Now, if you're worried that the police or the RCMP is about to come kick in your door, steal your property, and shoot your dog in the next few months, there is some good news on that front as well. It sounds like it isn't the plan for the RCMP to go around randomly looking for these firearms, as LeBlanc implied. I mean, it might be, but our committee a week after LeBlanc's statement had a slightly different idea of how it would work.
The $32 million represents a number of activities, I'll say. We've also got an IT system that we are evolving from a Phase 1 to Phase 2, leveraging a lot of the functionality that is in place now to support Phase 1 in businesses for individuals. We're working with other federal government departments in setting up a contact center to enable individuals that are participating in the program to call and seek secure support.
So it sounds like the plan is to have individuals sign up online with their IT software, and this is the same software that businesses are currently using for Phase 1 of the program, or to call in to arrange appropriate confiscation and destruction measures. And being that Canada Post refuses to help with Phase 2 of the buyback, it's likely that the police or the RCMP are only operating to fill that transportation void, since no company in Canada actually wants to get involved in the process. So what that means is most people will probably only see law enforcement at their doors by deliberate invitation. But if they're going to model Phase 2 after Phase 1, there may also be a cutoff by which you are required to sign up for this online software, otherwise you will no longer be eligible for participation in the program. And this deadline is likely going to be long before the current Amnesty expiration on October 30th in order to encourage compliance. After this deadline, if you don't voluntarily enter, then you might expect to see the police or RCMP at your doors, even without invitation. And all of that is assuming, of course, that your jurisdiction is even participating in the buyback program at all. Deputy RCMP Commissioner Brian Larkin also said something else of note during this committee.
We've also, that money is assisting us in the planning for phase 2, which is the individual collection, la rachette des personnes individuelles. And so we are working on this plan for 9 provinces, with the exception of Saskatchewan and Alberta.
You heard that right. There is currently no official RCMP plan for implementing the buyback in the entire provinces of Alberta or Saskatchewan. And if they don't even have like a rough plan by now, you can expect there will never be one at all. And this is certainly due to the Provincial Firearms Acts, which were passed in Saskatchewan and Alberta. These bills cannot supersede federal authority, but they can make it too expensive and tedious for the feds to confiscate firearms en masse. However, this does come with a problem. All that these bills really do is interfere with the buyback program itself. It actually does nothing to make these firearms lawful again. And it doesn't extend the amnesty for affected individuals. And what all of that means is that come October 31st, anyone in Alberta or Saskatchewan who still has these newly prohibited firearms, if they're still prohibited firearms at that point in time, will become criminals in possession of prohibited firearms, punishable by up to 5 years in prison per firearm. Meaning that these Provincial Firearms Acts have only really succeeded in preventing people from being compensated for their firearms, not in preventing innocent people from being criminalized or having their firearms confiscated. Now, just to be clear, that's not a dig at Daniel Smith or Scott Moe. The criminal code falls outside of their jurisdiction, so there isn't much that they could have actually realistically done. But I did want to point this out to people because I've heard a lot of people say that these Provincial Firearms Acts protect them from criminal liability. They absolutely do not. But, like I say, all of this is probably going to be a non-issue since we're going to have an election, likely in May here. But even if that doesn't happen, the next election is currently slated for October 25th. And even if the Liberals somehow manage to win another election, the amnesty would still likely have to be extended anyway, since most other provinces, including the Yukon, Manitoba, and Ontario, have already said that they will not use their own resources to help. And since the RCMP doesn't have a plan to confiscate from everyone on its own, it'll be up to each individual city to figure out how to confiscate firearms on behalf of the federal government, to which I say, yeah, good luck with that. So, what this all means is that there is still no real buyback program planned yet, and there is no way for them to roll it out at scale in the time needed before the amnesty expires, meaning they have to give up on it, extend it, or criminalize potentially millions of Canadians simply for existing. But realistically, it's likely that we're going to have an election and a real government implemented long before any of that actually becomes a concern. We are also expecting a ruling from the Federal Court of Appeal in the not too distant future here regarding the unlawful use of these order in councils, so that could easily put a very abrupt end to all of this nonsense as well. And hopefully this will be one of the last times I ever have to go about making a video detailing the progress of such a pointless and unethical program. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.